The air in the church felt thick like wet wool as I watched my father's casket. Julian didn't offer a hand to hold. Instead, he shoved a yellow envelope against my chest. 6 years of marriage ended with a sneer and a signature on my father's grave. He thinks he is leaving a penniless girl behind. He does not realize he just declared war on a $1 trillion empire. My name is Elena Vance, and today, I am burying the only man who ever truly loved me. I stood before the polished mahogany casket of my father, Arthur Vance, inside a drafty ancient church on the gray outskirts of Boston. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax, a suffocating mixture that made every breath feel like a chore. Outside, the New England winter hammered against the stained glass, but inside, the silence was even colder. My father had spent 40 years as a simple electrician, his hands permanently stained with grease and etched with the scars of hard labor. Looking at his peaceful face, I felt a hollow ache that threatened to pull me under. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church groaned open, letting in a swirl of freezing sleet. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The sharp, rhythmic click of expensive Italian leather loafers on the stone floor announced Julian Thorne. My husband did not walk toward me with the gait of a grieving son-in-law. He marched with the clinical precision of a man closing a business deal. In his hand, he clutched a bright yellow legal folder that looked garish and violent against the somber blacks and grays of the funeral. He reached my side but didn't offer a hand or a shoulder. He didn't even look at the casket. Instead, he leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and a hint of a peppermint he used to mask the scent of someone else's perfume. "Elena, it is time to face reality," he whispered into my ear, his voice a jagged blade. "This marriage. It has become a weight that I simply cannot carry for one more second. I am done, Elena. Finished with this life." I looked at him, my vision blurring. "Julian, not here. Not today. Please, have some respect for my father." Julian let out a short, dry laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Respect for what? For a penniless electrician with empty pockets, Arthur was a broke old man who died with nothing but a toolbox and a mountain of regrets. You need to be free. Elena, you need to find a life that is actually worthy of someone with your meager expectations. I am doing you a favor. Around us, the few guests who had come to pay their respects, mostly my father's old union buddies in their faded flannel shirts and work jackets, turned their heads. They looked at Julian with eyes full of pure, unadulterated contempt. They knew him for the vulture he was, but Julian didn't care. To him, these people were just background noise, as irrelevant as the dust on his shoes. He grabbed my elbow and steered me toward the small reception hall adjacent to the sanctuary. He didn't wait for the service to end. He sat me down at a folding metal table and slapped the yellow folder in front of me. A man I didn't recognize, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, stood behind him. "This is my private counsel," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying sort of hunger. "I have already signed. I am being generous. Elena, I will let you keep that pathetic rented house we live in. I won't ask for a single cent of the security deposit. Consider it a parting gift for the 6 years I wasted on you." I looked deep into his eyes and saw it clearly for the first time. There was no remnant of the man I thought I married. There was only greed and the rotting stench of betrayal. He thought he was discarding a piece of trash. He thought he had already won. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the pen the lawyer handed me. My heart was screaming, but deep inside, a strange, crystalline coldness began to take root. I leaned over the paper. The ink felt heavy as I scrolled my name across the bottom of the divorce decree. "There. It is done," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and a newfound, terrifying clarity. Julian snatched the papers back, a triumphant smirk stretching across his face. Good girl. Enjoy your poverty. Elena, it suits you. He turned on his heel and walked out of the church without a backward glance. Through the glass of the hall door, I watched him climb into a sleek black Mercedes waiting at the curb. I saw the silhouette of a woman in the passenger seat, Lydia Blackwood. She blew him a kiss as the car roared away into the slushy afternoon. I stood alone in the quiet hall, the ghost of my marriage fading with the exhaust fumes. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the cold, jagged edges of the master key my father had pressed into my hand just 48 hours before he took his last breath. He had looked me in the eye and told me it opened the door to my real life. Julian thought he had just signed a divorce. He had no idea he had just signed a death warrant for his own future. I spent 6 years building a pedestal for a man who was busy digging my grave. As I stood in the cold church, the memories of our marriage began to play back like a horror film I had been too blind to stop. I remembered the endless double shifts at Nexus Health Systems, where I pushed myself until my bones ached just to fund Julian's hollow dreams. I gave him 100% of my energy and my salary, while he spent his days in air-conditioned cafes, sketching out startup plans that were nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Julian was a master of the poor genius act. He would come home, eyes downcast, sighing about how the world wasn't ready for his brilliance. Elena, the venture capitalists, they just don't see the vision yet, he would murmur, leaning his head against my shoulder. If I could just get, maybe 10,000 more. Does your father still have that rainy day fund? I had been so desperate to be a supportive wife that I convinced my father to hand over $5,000 of his hard-earned savings. And then another $3,000. I even dipped into my own retirement fund, draining nearly $40,000 over 3 years. All the while, my father, Arthur Vance, would stop by our apartment in his stained blue electrician's jumpsuit, his boots caked with the dust of a 12-hour shift. Julian wouldn't even offer him a glass of water. He would stand in the corner, looking at my father with such intense disdain it made my skin crawl. He smells like burnt wires and failure. Elena, Julian told me one night after my father left. Must he always come here looking like a common laborer? It's embarrassing. I stayed silent, swallowing my pride because I thought love required patience. I even ignored the late nights when Julian would stumble in at 2 a.m, smelling of expensive bourbon and a floral, musky perfume that definitely didn't belong to me. When I questioned him, he had his lies ready. It's just the investor meetings. Elena, they are so exhausting. You wouldn't understand the pressure of high-stakes networking. The true cruelty didn't hit me until I looked for my mother's vintage pearl necklace and her diamond engagement ring. They were gone. Julian had pawned the only pieces of her I had left to buy designer handbags and $500 dinners for Lydia Blackwood. He was stealing my history to build a future with another woman. I had even turned down a massive promotion at Nexus, a senior vice president role that would have increased my pay by 50%. Just because Julian had faked a debilitating back injury for 3 months. I spent those weeks nursing him, bringing him meals in bed, while he was secretly texting Lydia about the penthouse he was planning to buy with my stolen money. The insults toward my father became a daily ritual. Julian would sneer whenever Arthur's name was mentioned. Your father he is an uneducated dinosaur. Elena, a man who works with his hands will never understand the mind of a disruptor like me. I had chosen to be the bridge between a simple, honest man and a flashy, deceptive one. I found an old, crumpled letter from my father in the bottom of my jewelry box yesterday. It was dated 4 years ago. Elena. It read, "Please watch your heart. There are wolves who wear the wool of sheep just to get close to the flock. Don't let your kindness become a cage." I had tucked that letter away, thinking my father just didn't understand modern ambition. But standing here now, the bitter truth is a cold weight in my stomach. I didn't just marry a man. I invited a predator into my home. I fed him, clothed him, and shielded him from the world while he sharpened his fangs. For nearly a decade, I nurtured a venomous snake, thinking that if I loved it enough, it wouldn't bite. I was wrong. The bite happened the moment he threw those papers on my father's casket. But he forgot one thing. A snake is only dangerous until you know exactly where its head is. The silence of the house was a lie. I returned to our rented apartment 2 hours after the funeral, my father's master key heavy in my pocket. The hallway was cluttered with unopened mail that Julian had conveniently ignored for weeks. I began to sift through the pile, and my heart skipped a beat. There were 6 red-stamped notices from 3 different banks. They were overdue alerts for credit cards I had never applied for, totaling over $45,000. My breath hitched as I realized every single account was tied to my Social Security number. I sat at the kitchen table and opened Julian's laptop. He had always kept it locked, but he was arrogant enough to use our wedding anniversary as his password. My stomach churned as I scrolled through his browser history. There were hundreds of searches for high-interest payday loans and private lenders. He hadn't been building a tech company. He had been using my identity as a personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle I never saw. I remembered the name my father had whispered in the hospital just 12 hours before he died. Gideon Reed. Call him. Elena. He knows the truth. I dialed the number. A man with a voice like gravel answered on the second ring. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a dimly lit office in the financial district. Gideon Reed didn't look like a private investigator. He looked like a weary college professor. He slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. I have been tracking your husband for 6 months. Mrs. Thorne, Gideon said, his eyes filled with a grim sort of pity. Your father hired me when he first noticed Julian's sudden interest in his property records. I opened the folder and felt the air leave my lungs. Julian said he was launching a software firm. He told me it was a revolutionary healthcare app. Gideon shook his head slowly. Julian doesn't have a firm. He runs a bottom-feeding real estate scam. He finds distressed properties and flips them using predatory loans. But here is the worst part. He forged your signature to take out a second mortgage on your father's apartment in Southie. He walked away with $200,000 in cash just last month. That was my father's only asset, I whispered, my voice cracking. He worked 40 years for that home. How could Julian? He didn't do it alone. Gideon interrupted, sliding a photograph toward me. It was Lydia Blackwood. Her real name is Lydia Vance, no relation to you, though she uses many aliases. She is a professional hunter. She has been sued 4 times in 3 different states for identity theft and financial elder abuse. She is the one who coached Julian on how to drain your accounts. I stared at a bank statement showing a wire transfer of $85,000 from my personal savings to a luxury developer. Julian had used my life savings as a down payment for a penthouse on the waterfront for Lydia. He had even faked his medical records to claim $25,000 from my workplace insurance policy during that time he pretended to have a broken back. I had spent 90 days carrying him to the bathroom while he was using the payout to buy Lydia a diamond tennis bracelet. Gideon reached into his desk and pulled out a final set of photos. They were dated yesterday, exactly 4 hours after my father's heart stopped beating. Julian and Lydia were at an oyster bar, clinking glasses of vintage champagne. Julian was laughing, his head thrown back in pure joy. They weren't just waiting for him to die. Elena, Gideon said quietly. They were counting down the minutes. Julian believed Arthur had a secret stash of cash hidden in that apartment. He wanted that small-time electrician inheritance so badly he was willing to let your father die alone in that hospital room. A cold, agonizing clarity settled over me. Julian hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had turned my father's death into a business opportunity. He saw my grief as a distraction he could exploit. I stood up, my shaking hands finally going still. The woman who had entered this office was a grieving widow. The woman leaving it was something else entirely, He thinks I am a victim, I said, my voice as sharp as a winter frost. He thinks he left me with nothing but a pile of debt and a broken heart. I am going to let him keep smiling until I take away the very air he breathes. The memories shifted like sand in a glass, pulling me back to a dimly lit corner booth at a small diner on the edge of town, exactly 24 hours before my father drew his final breath. That night, the man sitting across from me wasn't the Arthur Vance I had known for my entire life. The grease-stained overalls were gone, replaced by a charcoal gray bespoke suit that fit him with the authority of a king. He didn't look like a tired electrician. He looked like the architect of the world. He slid a heavy, leather-bound folder across the scratched laminate table, his eyes bright with a fire I had never seen before. "Dad, what is this? Why are you dressed like a billionaire?" I asked, my voice trembling as I touched the cold leather of the folder. He reached out and covered my hand with his. His grip was firm, no longer shaking with the tremors of age. Everything you thought you knew about our life. Elena. It was a shield. My name is Arthur Vance, and I am the founder and silent majority shareholder of Vanguard Global. We own the skyline of this city and the technology that runs its heart. The empire is worth more than $1 trillion. The breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. I stared at him, my mind racing through the 40 years of our simple life, the cramped apartments, the used cars, the way he always insisted on fixing his own boots, why I managed to choke out, why live like a pauper when you had all this I had to know. Adeline, he said, using my birth name, a name he only used for the most serious of matters. I had to know who you would become without the shadow of a mountain of gold, and I had to see the true face of the man you chose to bring into our family. I have lived this way for years to protect you from the vultures, and to see if Julian Thorne was a man of honor or a wolf in a cheap suit. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, cold hum. I have known about his betrayals for 18 months. I have watched him steal from your accounts and whisper lies to that woman, Lydia. I didn't stop him because I was building a cage. I have spent my final days constructing a legal fortress around you that no one can penetrate. He stood up and gestured toward a woman sitting in the shadows of the booth behind us. She was sharp, dressed in a power suit that screamed authority. This was Sarah Thorne, the most feared estate attorney in the country, a woman whose hourly rate was more than my monthly salary at the hospital. Sarah has prepared everything, my father said. I opened the folder and my vision blurred. I saw deeds to 12 penthouse properties, majority shares in 5 of the world's largest tech firms, and bank statements with so many zeros they didn't seem real. It was a sea of wealth that stretched beyond the horizon. "You need to sign these, Adeline," Sarah said, her voice like clicking glass as she laid out a stack of documents. "This is an irrevocable trust. It places the entirety of the Vance estate under your sole control. Most importantly, it contains a clause that strictly excludes any current or former spouse from ever laying claim to a single penny, regardless of any marriage contracts or local laws." My hand was steady as I picked up the pen. I wasn't just signing for money. I was signing for my freedom. I thought of Julian's sneer and his mocking comments about my father's empty pockets. "Dad, I want to make him pay," I whispered, the bitterness rising in my throat like bile. "I want him to feel every bit of the pain he caused you." My father gave me a small, sad smile and squeezed my shoulder. "You don't need to seek revenge, Adeline. That is the secret of real power. You just need to be still. You just need to let that man walk into the very trap he has spent years digging for himself. Let his own greed be his executioner." As I walked out of that diner and into the rainy night, the weight of the folder felt like a weapon. I was no longer the discarded wife of a two-bit scammer. I was the heir to a $1 trillion throne, and the storm I was bringing was going to wash Julian Thorne and his lies straight into the gutter. Sarah Thorne sat across from me in a suite at the Four Seasons, her fingers dancing across a laptop that was linked to every financial artery in the state. We worked through the night, the only light coming from the glowing screens and the city skyline 30 floors below. The silence was broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional click of a mouse. He didn't even wait for the body to get cold. "Elena," Sarah said, sliding a digital contract toward me. "Julian signed a preliminary agreement to sell your father's Southie apartment to a shell corporation called Blackwood Holdings at exactly 4:15 in the afternoon on Tuesday. That was just 60 minutes after the hospital pronounced your father dead." I stared at the forged signature on the document. It was a sloppy imitation of mine, a desperate grab for a quick $1 million. "Should we freeze the sale?" Sarah asked, her pen hovering over a motion for an injunction. I shook my head, a cold smile touching my lips. "No. Let him do it. Let him sign every fraudulent document he can find. The deeper he digs this hole, the harder it will be for him to ever climb out. I want him to think he has succeeded in stealing everything. It is a risky game." "Elena," Sarah warned, her eyes narrowing. "It is only a risk if he knows I am watching," I replied. I spent the next 3 hours systematically moving what remained of our joint assets. I transferred every cent, exactly $18,400, into a newly established anonymous charity called the Arthur Vance Legacy Fund. To the banks, the account looked empty. To Julian, it would look like I had spent it in a fit of grief-induced madness. Then, I picked up my phone. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I needed him to believe I was breaking. "Julian, please. I can't do this alone." I sobbed into the receiver, my voice cracking perfectly. "The house. It feels so empty. I think I am having a breakdown. I don't know what to do with the bills. Please come home." "For God's sake, Elena, pull yourself together," he snapped, his voice thick with irritation and the background noise of a television. "I am in the middle of a massive deal. I told you, I need space. Just sign whatever the lawyers send you and stay out of my way." He hung up, and I instantly wiped the tears from my face. While he was dreaming of his massive deal with a firm called Sterling Capital, he had no idea that I had just authorized Sarah to buy 90% of Sterling's parent company for $55 million through a blind trust. By Monday morning, I wouldn't just be his ex-wife. I would be his employer. I picked up a burner phone and sent a single text to a number Gideon Reed had provided for Lydia. He isn't the only one who inherited a fortune this week. Ask him about the secondary trust. I knew Lydia's greed would do the rest of the work for me. She would start clawing at him, demanding more than he could possibly steal. Finally, Sarah opened a video file on her tablet. It was my father, recorded just 1 week ago. He looked strong, sitting in a leather chair with a glass of scotch in his hand. "Adeline," he said to the camera, his voice steady, "if you are watching this, it means the wolf has shown his teeth. Remember, a man like Julian Thorne thinks he is a predator because he hunts those he thinks are weak, but he has no idea what happens when the mountain he is standing on decides to move. I have officially disinherited him. I have officially stripped him of every possible claim in the event of a divorce. He is a ghost in our house now." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his protection. As the sun began to rise over Boston on the morning of the funeral, I dressed in a simple black silk dress. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. Every account was flagged, every trap was set, and every one of Julian's moves was already recorded. He was walking into that church believing he was holding the winning hand, but I was the one who owned the casino. The church was quiet until Julian arrived, but he didn't come alone. 2 photographers and a man with a handheld video camera followed him like flies around a carcass. He had actually hired a public relations team to document my humiliation at my own father's funeral. He walked down the center aisle with a predatory swagger, his expensive suit shimmering under the dim chandeliers. "Look at her," Julian announced to the small crowd, gesturing toward me as I stood by the altar. The grieving widow of a man who couldn't even leave her enough to pay for the coffee at the reception. It is a tragedy. Really. He walked right up to the mahogany casket. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage that felt like liquid nitrogen in my veins. He reached into his blazer and pulled out the yellow folder. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the lid of my father's coffin. The sound of paper hitting wood echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted ceiling. "There," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the back pews to hear every word. "That is the ultimate release. I am giving you your freedom. Elena, consider it. Consider it my final act of charity." He turned toward a group of my former colleagues from Nexus Health Systems, people who had seen me work 90-hour weeks to keep our heads above water while he played at being a businessman. "She is a zero now," Julian mocked, laughing as he straightened his silk tie. "No house, no money, and no father to bail her out. She is back to being just a poor girl from Southie. Exactly where she belongs." He shoved a second document under my nose, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying sort of malice. "Sign this, Elena. It is a waiver. It says you voluntarily give up every single right to any future assets I might acquire. I want a clean break. No alimony, no claims. No dragging me down with your poverty anymore. Sign it, and I will be generous enough not to sue you for the debts your father left behind." I looked at the lawyer standing behind him. The man looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between me and the pen he was holding out. I took the pen with a hand that was unnervingly steady. I signed the name Adeline Vance in my heart, even as the signature of Elena Thorne appeared on the paper. I felt the last chord of our marriage snap, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "I will sign it. Julian," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "I want you to have exactly what you deserve." Julian smirked, snatching the paper from the table. He turned to the cameras, his face glowing with a sickening triumph. "I am finally moving on to a woman who actually understands what it means to live at the top. I am marrying Lydia the moment the ink is dry on this. A real woman, not a glorified maid for a dying electrician." A wave of murmurs rippled through the guests. I saw my father's old friends, men with calloused hands and honest eyes, clenching their fists in the pews. I caught their gaze and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Not yet." I looked down at the casket and whispered a silent thank you to the man inside. "Thank you, Dad, for the shield." Julian led the reporters toward the foyer, holding court as if he were at a tech gala instead of a house of God. "It was a mistake from the beginning," he told a woman with a microphone, marrying the daughter of a man who spent his life crawling through basements. "It was a lapse in judgment. I am a visionary. I belong in the penthouse, not in the gutter with people like the Vances." He stepped out onto the stone stairs of the church, his black Mercedes idling at the curb. I stood at the threshold, a shadow in the doorway, watching his back. Just as his foot hit the pavement, his phone chimed. It was a sharp, high-pitched notification that cut through the freezing winter air. Julian pulled the device from his pocket, the arrogant smirk still etched on his face. I watched it vanish in an instant. I watched the blood drain from his skin until he was as pale as the marble statues behind me. It was an email from the High Court of Massachusetts, a digital ghost of my father's wrath. Notice of civil litigation. Vance versus Thorne. Amount in dispute $50 million. He looked back at the church, his eyes wide and frantic, scanning the darkness of the entrance. He didn't see me. I was already stepping back into the silence, knowing that the man who thought he had just won was actually a corpse walking toward a cage. The clock had finally struck 0. Julian shoved his way into the opulent lobby of First National Bank, with Lydia clinging to his arm like a designer accessory. He looked every bit the victor, flashing a smile that was meant to say he had finally arrived. He slammed his ID onto the teller's desk alongside the death certificate of my father. "I am here to settle the estate of Arthur Vance," Julian said, his voice ringing with a false sense of authority. "Close the accounts and transfer the balance, all $500,000 of it, to my personal holding." The teller, a young woman with a sharp gaze, spent 5 minutes clicking through her system, her brow furrowed as she looked at the screen and then back at Julian. "Sir, I am afraid there is a misunderstanding. There is no account under the name of Arthur Vance at this institution. Never has been." Julian's smile faltered, his hand twitching on the marble counter. That is ridiculous. Check again. He was a client for 40 years. Use the Social Security number in that file." "I have checked, sir," she said, her voice becoming clinical and cold. "Furthermore, I have a notification here regarding several credit cards under the name of Elena Thorne. All 7 accounts have been flagged and locked due to suspicious activity and suspected identity fraud. If you are the one who attempted to use the platinum card this morning, I am required to call security." Julian's face turned a muddy shade of gray. I don't... "Lydia, let's go. There must be a mistake at the other branch. This girl is incompetent." They practically ran to the black Mercedes and sped toward the waterfront, toward the $2 million penthouse Julian had bought with the money he stole from my retirement. But when they arrived, they weren't met by a concierge holding the door. They were met by 2 men in dark suits and a strip of bright yellow federal tape across the mahogany doors. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian screamed at the officers, his voice cracking with hysteria. "That is my property. I have the deed in my car. This unit is under a seizure order. Mr. Thorne," the officer replied, handing him a laminated card without an ounce of emotion. "The funds used for the down payment have been traced back to a series of shell companies involved in a massive money laundering investigation. You are barred from entry. Any attempt to cross this line will result in your immediate arrest." Julian's hands were shaking so hard he nearly dropped his phone. He dialed the number for his lead investor at Sterling Capital, the man who was supposed to wire him $10 million by noon to save his failing business. Pick up, you coward," Julian hissed, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. A woman's voice answered, but it wasn't the usual secretary. "Sterling Capital has been acquired by an anonymous conglomerate as of 9 o'clock this morning. Mr. Thorne, all pending contracts with your firm have been terminated due to a failure in the due diligence process. We do not do business with criminals. Good luck." Just then, a man in a plain windbreaker stepped out of the shadows of the lobby and tapped Julian on the shoulder. He handed him a thick stack of legal papers. Julian Thorne. "You've been served. Identity theft, 3 counts of insurance fraud, and grand larceny. A man named Gideon Reed provided the police with a very detailed map of your activities. Don't leave town." Lydia, who had been silent until now, suddenly shoved Julian away from her. The mask of the elegant lover shattered, revealing the jagged edges of a shark. "You told me you had the money," she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made the officers look over. You pathetic loser, if you don't get me $500,000 for a lawyer right now. "I am going to tell the feds every single thing you did. I am not going to jail for a failed con man." Julian didn't even hear her. He was frantically tearing into the yellow folder he had stolen from my father's room, the folder he thought was the real will. He scanned the pages, his eyes bulging as he read the fine print. It wasn't a list of inheritance, it was a list of debts. Promissory notes, signed by him through his fraudulent shell companies, owing exactly $12 million to a firm called EV Holdings. No, no, this can't. She tricked me. Julian gasped, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as he clutched his chest. The debt. It is all in my name. Every single penny belongs to her companies. He stumbled back to his lawyer's office, screaming to anyone who would listen that he wanted to cancel the divorce. I take it back, Julian yelled, slamming his fists on the lawyer's desk. The papers I signed at the church. They aren't real. I was under duress. I want her back. I want the marriage to be legal again. The lawyer looked at him with a mixture of disgust and pity. The agreement you signed was an immediate, non-revocable waiver. Julian, you explicitly renounced all claims to her assets and her family name. It was filed electronically 10 minutes after you left the church. You are legally a stranger to her now. Julian slumped into a chair, the weight of his own trap finally crushing his chest. He reached for a discarded magazine on the coffee table, his eyes catching a glimpse of a familiar face. There, on the glossy cover of the December issue of Global Finance, was a woman in a midnight blue power suit. She looked like a goddess of war. The headline read, Adeline Vance, the secret trillionaire, heir. Taking the helm of Vanguard Global, Elena Julian whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. She was the queen, and I treated her like dirt. He looked out the window at the city he thought he had conquered, realizing he was just a speck of dust about to be swept into the dark. I sat in the dim light of a private lounge at the Vanguard building, watching Lydia Blackwood through a one-way mirror. She looked haggard, her designer silk scarf frayed at the edges. She had reached out to my legal team 3 hours ago, offering to trade her freedom for Julian's head on a platter. When I finally walked into the room, she didn't even look up at first. You want to survive this, Lydia, I asked, my voice echoing in the small, cold space. She looked at me, her eyes bloodshot and her voice trembling. He told me we were a team, Elena. Adeline, whatever your name is, he said you were a drain on his soul, that you were nothing but a weight around his neck. I leaned in, sliding a tablet toward her. It showed a high-resolution blueprint of her own apartment with a red dot pulsing in the living room. Lydia, do you really think a man who steals from his wife wouldn't steal from his mistress? Look behind the baseboard, near your vanity. That is a high-frequency microphone Julian installed 5 months ago. He knows about the $20,000 you've been skimming from his real estate deals. He was just waiting for the right moment to blackmail you into taking the fall for all of it. Lydia's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her breath hitched, and she gripped the edge of the table. That snake! He made me sign those papers for the Southie mortgage. He told me it was just a formality. I have the originals. Adeline, I kept them in a safety deposit box he doesn't know about. I'll give them to you. I'll give you everything if you just keep the feds off my back. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Inside were the original forged signatures, the physical proof that would send Julian to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. While Lydia was betraying him in a high-rise, Julian was acting out his own final act of desperation. He had taken a crowbar to the door of my father's old workshop, believing there was a secret vault filled with gold bars. He didn't find gold. He found 4 security guards from Vanguard Global and a silent alarm that had already alerted the Boston Police Department. An hour later, I stood in the observation room of the precinct. Julian was slumped in a metal chair, his expensive suit now covered in drywall dust. A detective paced around him, throwing photos of my father's funeral on the table. You knew he had a heart condition, didn't you? Thorne the detective barked. You intentionally pressured him. You created a high-stress environment to accelerate his end so you could grab the cash. Julian's voice was a pathetic whimper, his chest heaving. No, no, it wasn't like that. It was just business. Elena. Please, let me talk to Elena. My phone buzzed. It was a call from the precinct. I didn't answer. Instead, I sent a single audio file to his attorney to play for him. It wasn't a message of mercy. It was the recording from the funeral. Julian's own voice mocking my father, calling him a broke old man and a pauper. Elena, please, I'll do anything. Julian sobbed when the recording ended, his voice cracking with a desperate, ugly fear. I'll be a good husband. I'll go to therapy. I'll work for you. Just get me out of here. A man stepped into the room then, a man Julian didn't recognize, but whose life he had ruined years ago. Stephen Walsh. He was one of Lydia's former marks, a man who had lost his family's hardware business to their schemes. He stood next to me, his face a portrait of cold justice. He's not the only one. Julian, I said through the intercom, my voice like ice. My father didn't just work as an electrician. He spent 18 months recording you. Every dinner with Lydia, every forged signature, every time you laughed at his poverty in our kitchen. He saw it all. You weren't the hunter. You were the specimen under a microscope. The door to the interrogation room opened again, and the police led Lydia in. The moment their eyes met, the love they had touted at the funeral vanished. You set me up, Julian screamed, lunging across the table until the handcuffs snapped him back. You were the one who told me to take the mortgage. You, greedy bitch. Lydia didn't flinch. She spat on the floor near his feet, her lip curling in disgust. I gave them the originals, Julian. I told them everything. I hope you rot in a cell for 99 years. You pathetic, small-time loser. They were still screaming at each other, their voices cracking with hatred and fear as I walked out of the precinct. The air outside was freezing, but for the first time in 6 years, I could finally breathe. Julian walked into the headquarters of Thorn Ventures at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, his chest puffed out with a desperate, shaky bravado. He expected his staff to cower or his investors to be waiting with pens ready. Instead, he found 2 men in dark suits standing outside his office door. His lead assistant, a woman he had belittled for 3 years, wouldn't even meet his eyes as she packed her desk. What is this? Julian demanded, his voice cracking. I have a meeting with the board. We are finalizing the $10 million infusion from Sterling Capital. One of the men handed him a single sheet of paper. There is no meeting, Mr. Thorne. Sterling Capital, which, as of 9 o'clock this morning, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Global, has exercised its right to terminate your contract for cause. You are being removed as CEO, effective immediately. You have 10 minutes to vacate the premises. Julian's face went white. You can't do this to me. I built this Who authorized this? The owner did. The man replied coldly. By noon, the news was a wildfire. Every single one of Julian's investors had withdrawn their support, filing a class action lawsuit for securities fraud and embezzlement. His bank accounts were drained to 0, and his credit score, once his pride, had plummeted to the bottom. He was a ghost in a suit, a man who had gone from a self-proclaimed visionary to a bankrupt criminal in less than 48 hours. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I stood behind a podium at the Vanguard Global headquarters. The room was packed with reporters from every major financial outlet in the country. I wore my father's old silver watch on my wrist, a reminder of the man who had built this empire with his bare hands. Today, I am proud to announce the launch of the Arthur Vance Legacy Fund, I said, my voice steady and clear, projecting through the microphones. This foundation will provide $50 million in its first year to support victims of financial abuse and domestic manipulation. My father believed that true power belongs to those who protect, not those who exploit. I paused, pressing a button on a remote. A giant screen behind me flickered to life. The entire room went silent as the footage from my father's funeral began to play. The city watched in horror as Julian Thorne sneered at a grieving daughter and threw divorce papers onto a mahogany casket. The betrayal was so visceral, so cruel, that the collective gasp from the press was audible. By the time the video ended, Julian Thorne wasn't just a failed businessman, he was the most hated man in Boston. The fall was total. By Tuesday evening, Julian was standing on the sidewalk outside our apartment, his designer suitcases piled around him. The landlord had changed the locks. Citing 3 months of unpaid rent that Julian had hidden from me, he dragged his bags to the black Mercedes. But when he tried to start the engine, a tow truck was already backing up. "Wait, this is my car." Julian screamed, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and tears. I paid for this." "You can't take it. The bank says otherwise, pal," the driver muttered, hooking the chain. "Repossession order. Move aside or I'm calling the cops." That night, the man who dreamed of penthouses slept in the backseat of a car that didn't belong to him, parked in a dark alley. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the bitter taste of his own medicine. Across town, at a high-end pawn shop, Lydia Blackwood was facing her own reckoning. She was trying to sell a vintage pearl necklace and a diamond engagement ring, my mother's jewelry. Before the shopkeeper could even offer a price, 4 police officers swarmed the store. "Lydia Blackwood, you are under arrest for possession of stolen property and conspiracy to commit grand larceny," the detective said, snapping the cuffs on her wrists. "No, Julian." "Julian gave these to me. He said they were his." She shrieked, her voice echoing through the shop. "Please, I didn't know." "He lied to me. He lied about everything. I watched the footage of her arrest from the top floor of the Vanguard building." I walked into my father's office, now my office, and sat in the heavy leather chair. The room smelled of old books and the faint, comforting scent of the cedar oil he used for his tools. I was the CEO of a $1 trillion empire, not because of the money, but because I had survived the fire. Suddenly, my desk intercom buzzed. "Ms. Vance, there is a man in the lobby. He's making a scene. He says he needs to see his wife." I looked at the security monitor. Julian was standing in the marble lobby, looking like a shattered man. He was blocked by 6 massive security guards. I recognized them all. They were my father's old friends from the union, the electricians Julian had mocked. They stood like a wall of granite, their arms crossed, looking at him with nothing but cold indifference. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window and looked down. Julian caught sight of me. He fell to his knees, pressing his hands against the glass doors of the building, his mouth moving in a silent, desperate plea. "Elena, please, I have nowhere to go." I could almost hear his whimpering through the reinforced glass. I'm sorry. Please, give me another chance. I'll do anything." I looked at him for a long beat. There was no pity in my heart, no lingering spark of the love I once felt. There was only a profound sense of relief. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply turned my back on him and walked toward the conference table where my advisors were waiting. The final blow came an hour later. The court issued a summary judgment, ruling that every single asset Julian had acquired through his fraudulent schemes, including the properties he tried to hide, would be liquidated and transferred directly to the Arthur Vance Legacy Fund. He had spent 6 years stealing from me, and in the end, he had simply spent 6 years working for my father's charity. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of cold, hard justice on that Tuesday morning. I sat in the front row, wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than Julian's failed company, watching as the man I once called my husband was led in wearing shackles. Beside him, Lydia Blackwood looked small and broken, her expensive highlights grown out and her face stripped of the makeup she used as armor. The judge didn't waste any time. The evidence provided by Gideon Reed and the original documents from Lydia were undeniable. Julian Thorne, for the counts of grand larceny, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, the judge declared, her voice booming through the silent room. Lydia Blackwood, for your role in these crimes and your history of financial predation, you are sentenced to 8 years. Julian collapsed against the defense table, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He turned his head, his eyes finding mine for the first time since the arrest. Elena, please. You have to tell them. You have to stop this, he shrieked, the bailiffs grabbing his arms as he tried to lung toward me. You were nothing. Just a girl from a drafty apartment. How could you do this to me? I was the one with the vision. You're supposed to be broke. I didn't blink. I didn't even feel the urge to look away. I simply watched as they dragged him out, his screams echoing down the marble hallway until they were silenced by the heavy courtroom doors. Later that afternoon, Sarah Thorne met me at the Vanguard headquarters. She handed me a final letter from my father, one that had been sealed until the verdict was read. As I read it, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. My father hadn't died from the stress Julian had inflicted on him. That was the lie Arthur had allowed Julian to believe, so he would move faster and more recklessly into the trap. My father had passed away in his sleep, surrounded by his oldest friends, with a smile on his face because he knew I was finally awake. He had chosen the timing of the reveal perfectly. He had left this world not as a victim, but as a grandmaster who had already won the game. I spent the next 48 hours erasing Julian Thorne from the face of the earth. I sold the black Mercedes, the designer furniture, and even the apartment lease. Every cent of the proceeds, nearly $300,000, was funneled directly into the charity. I didn't want a single thread of his greed left in my life. I drove out to the old church in the outskirts of Boston as the sun began to set. The winter air was crisp, and the ground was dusted with a light layer of snow. I walked to my father's grave and placed a bundle of white lilies on the stone. I did it. Dad, I whispered, the wind catching my words. I kept the promise. I am living for myself now. I am happy, and I am finally, truly free. I didn't just keep the money for myself. I took the 12 residential buildings my father had secretly owned and converted them into the Vance sanctuaries. They became permanent, high-security housing for women who had been broken by financial abuse and domestic betrayal. I staffed them with the best lawyers and counselors money could buy. And to protect them, I hired the only men I knew I could trust. My father's old electrician buddies, the men who had spent 40 years working in the trenches with him, now formed the elite security and advisory board of Vanguard Global. They weren't just employees, they were family. I realized then that true wealth wasn't the $1 trillion valuation of the company or the penthouses scattered across the globe. It was the resilience my father had forged in me during those years of simplicity. It was the kindness that Julian had mistaken for weakness, which had ultimately become my greatest weapon. As night fell, I stood on the observation deck of the Vanguard Tower, the highest point in the city. The lights of Boston twinkled below me like fallen stars. I looked out at the horizon with a heart that felt light and a mind that was sharp with purpose. I was no longer the girl who was being hunted. I was the one who owned the forest, hundreds of miles away, in a cramped gray cell that smelled of bleach and despair. Julian Thorne sat on a thin cot. He picked up a crumpled, weeks-old newspaper from the floor. On the front page was a photo of me, Adeline Vance, looking radiant and powerful at the opening of a new hospital wing. He stared at the image, his hands shaking, and then his eyes drifted to the bottom of the article where a copy of the divorce decree was printed as part of a public record. He saw the signature, the sharp, elegant lines of the woman he had mocked. He realized in that moment that the very paper he had used to humiliate me at the funeral was the iron bar that would keep him in the dark for the next 15 years. Thank you so much for listening to this journey of betrayal and ultimate justice. I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story right now? Please comment below to share your location and your thoughts on Elena's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this powerful tale of justice.